what we wanted to do this morning was to have a panel to discuss kind of the process by which Accumulo and other government-started projects have kind of ended up in the open source community. So how did they get there? And we'll kind of walk through some of those things. So our panelists this morning, Aaron Cordova, which we found out was the potential fall guy yesterday, and Billie Rinaldi, both very, very early on, been with Accumulo since the beginning. Joe Witt, which most, a lot of folks attended his talk last night. Joe's actually in traffic and should be here momentarily. He'll be joining us on the panel as well. So with that said, why don't we go ahead and dive right in. So Accumulo, I think you guys started development around 2008, if I remember correctly, right? And if I remember correctly, it was open sourced around 2011, somewhere in that ballpark, right?
Yeah.
So take us back to before 2011, right? So when it was still a government project, how did it come about, the notion to decide to open source this? What did that look like?
Is your mic turned on?
Take a second.
So I think we had. So I feel like for the first year, we thought that maybe it would be cool if we open sourced it, but we everyone wasn't totally decided at that point. So it wasn't until about a year later that we decided we definitely wanted to, and then we had about 2 years of actually working through what it would take for us to do that. Let's see, we tried to, we weren't the first thing that had gone open source. There was SE Linux, and the same guys were also working on an external open source project, so we were able to get some tips for them. But in the Accumulo open sourcing process, we tried to basically make a template for future things to be open sourced, like a set of documents, like these are what you fill out, this is what you have to agree to. Part of it was a sort of careful scoping of what exactly is open source and how people can work on that in an interactive way while they're still government employees. And I think Joe isn't quite here yet, but he did use the templates. He went through the same process Accumulo went through, and he got through it in about 10 months. So we're getting that time down a little bit. So hopefully more people will try, and we'll be able to reduce that time even further. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do remember very early on. If I remember correctly, some of us are pushing very hard to argue that it should be open source. In fact, we started the development all on an unclassed environment, and we were trying to figure out yesterday, at some point we moved it to a classified environment to all the source code. And I think the primary reason was we had testing resources on the high side, so to speak. We had a bunch of machines we could use to do scale testing very early on, which was crucial, and we didn't really have those on the low side. And I think that ended up, in hindsight, delaying the release of Accumulo as an open source project. I think it might have happened a little earlier had we kept all the development unclassified. So if I guess we're going to talk about that later, but one of the things that maybe I would have done differently was, try to keep the development unclassified as early as possible. And I've been on government projects since then that have started on unclassified networks and stayed on unclassified networks, and they just regularly push the code up. And that's great. It seems to streamline development quite a bit because you have access to other resources. And open source is all about sharing. So very early on, we were building on HDFS, which is open source. We ended up using a few classes. I think they're still there. from the Hadoop project, not from the HBase project, but we ended up sharing some classes from the Hadoop MapReduce project, and it's very beneficial to be able to kind of have access to the open internet, and there's a lot of tools and things like that are beneficial to use. So so that I remember being a feature of our early development was that decision of where do we do it? You know, do we do it on the high side or do we do it on the low side? And so once something's on the high side, is a lot of folks probably know, getting it back is like pulling teeth, right? Like it takes such a huge effort that it's so much easier just to keep it unclassified if you can.
Yeah, I was also thinking that in addition to the process of open sourcing software, we also had to work on like how do we get the software back inside once it's outside in a like regularly repeatable manner, so that we could have updated versions as often as possible.
Okay, very, very good. So, Joe, I'm gonna put you on the spot here. So we just got started, and the kind of question was, so why don't we first off, almost I'm sure everybody in the room hopefully is familiar with Accumulo at this point. So the backstory is not as relevant, but so we had a good turnout at like I said, at the talk last night. But for those that weren't there, can you just give a top level, kind of 10,000-foot view of Nifi, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Sure. What Nifi was born to do basically was connect systems at NSA. Started in 2006, grew up over a period of 8 or so years, and then finally they let me release it to the wild.
All right, fair enough. So Billy and Aaron were mentioning a moment ago that having gone through the process, there was some documentation put in place, and that that was something you were able to leverage. So I just wonder if you could comment on the from the decision point to actually go open source on Nifi. What was that process like on your end to where you are today, and how long it took you to get there, and so forth?
So I'll start by saying that I'm sure there were other people involved, but at the end of the day, Billy's kind of my hero. Because for me, a lot of the documentation and things that I learned about the process that we needed to follow came directly from stuff that she had provided, and frankly, it just made it a lot easier for us. I didn't really have a good appreciation for just really basic things like licensing and how that meant and how that tied to contracts, and what the Accumulo folks had done, and particularly based on stuff I had talked about with Billy, it just gave us kind of an on-ramp to follow. Now the process still was not fun, but I'm sure it was a lot more fun than it was for Billy and Adam and others who had to kind of trudge through it the first time themselves. So genuinely very thankful for that.
All right, very good. So one question that I was chatting with Aaron about this beforehand is both of these projects decided to, right, you have the decision when you open source something, right? Where do I go with that, right? Do I go, first off, licensing, right? Which licensing model makes sense? What sort of community do I want to steer this thing towards, right? In both of these cases, the projects ended up at the Apache Foundation. So can you comment on how that decision came about, and specifically the kind of the process of how you go from those discussions with the foundation to ultimately a top level, through incubating into a top level project like Accumulo is?
Let's see. We've definitely found the Apache Software Foundation a good place to start to build a community, which is important for projects like Accumulo that don't, like, a lot of people don't know about. So that was very helpful. Having in some ways, Apache having like fixed processes to follow as far as how people give patches and how things get committed was really beneficial. I mean, maybe partly we were coming from a government world, so we're used to dealing with policies and procedures, but also not having it so that just anyone can start checking in things to the code base. I think that made a lot of people more comfortable with the idea of open sourcing it. And let's see. In addition, I think it gave a bit more visibility, even just in people working on other projects at the Apache Software Foundation. We got mentors from within there.
But so when you're an Apache Software Foundation project, are they the copyright holder officially of the software?
Let's see.
Some people are nodding yes.
So I guess for code developed specifically like at the Apache Software Foundation,
Yeah.
they're the copyright holder. There's also, so each contributor, well, I guess each committer signs
Signs
a
something,
license agreement.
Right.
So if that committer holds copyright, they're sort of signing rights
Yeah.
to that over to the
that
Apache
foundation.
Software Foundation. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that highlights an important point too. Is that, and this is kind of now I realize like I'm really wanting to answer some of these questions in reverse order.
Feel free.
So
Go
and so this basically the first question is, well, why open source it, and then why Apache,
ASF, yeah.
and why and for me, we thought that if we're gonna spend all this time building this massive piece of infrastructure, we don't want it to just we don't want to finish it and then just have it kind of die in the bowels of a large government organization over time. We wanted it to, software requires certain things to survive. So it needs, whether it's commercial or open source, it needs both, an active development community, and sometimes that's just a company, but if it's not a company, then it has to be some other type of community. And then, so asking the agency to agree to open source it eventually was kind of a going in condition for some of us. It was like, if this is something, it's going to be a big government piece of software like that's GOTS forever and it's never going to see the light of day. That's just going to be too hard to support over time. So open source is a way of keeping software alive, and the Apache Foundation is important because you assign the copyright. They are a nonprofit, so no one company, no one organization really controls it. It's truly a community. The Apache Software Foundation is an organization, but it allows people to truly build a community of people from anywhere. And that's important because there's some open source projects like MongoDB where it's open source, but the company holds the copyright, right? And so they're going to make decisions about licensing based on the company, whereas the Apache Software Foundation is truly a foundation created in the interest of community-driven software. So that was very important. The other good reason is Hadoop is all Apache. Apache is a very friendly license, by the way. It's commercially friendly. So you can take an Apache licensed piece of software, package it into some proprietary software, and close it. You don't have to open source everything like you have to do with the GPL. So all those decisions were driven by what's the best environment for the software to thrive, and what's the best legal environment to allow everybody who wants to contribute to contribute, and for no to basically take the power for any one organization away, for any one organization to really drive the project into the ground. And but because of that, because it relies on a community, now you have a huge amount of work to do around building a community, and that's where all the effort of Billy and Adam and folks that were there in 2011. That's a huge amount of work. So it's not just a matter of kind of slapping a license on all the source files and uploading it to GitHub or whatever. It's really a social effort. And but knowing, so those were our goals going in. It's not the only way to do it. There's other licenses. There's other ways to host the software. And you're right too. The Apache Software Foundation provides a whole process, which to a lot of people I think might appear onerous at first, right? But it's really intended to foster that kind of community building. I mean, has that been your experience and you as well, Joe? Because you're just getting into that now, right? You're on the project management committee, I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And at some point, you learn the processes and policies are about helping projects grow. So, I mean, Apache just wants to find things that work for a lot of its project management committees or projects, and they are open to changing things if things aren't working for a particular project anymore. So they're not, fixed policies for their own sake. They're all in service of helping the projects grow and grow their communities. Yeah.
And they definitely will push back if they see that, like, the PMC is kind of like not kind of doing the things it should be doing. They'll kind of give you a nice nudge, and I think it could definitely rub certain personalities the wrong way. So you want to make sure you're comfortable with that before you decide to jump into Apache. But for us, for Accumulo, I think it's been awesome.
Yeah, other advantages of Apache are that all of the communications and decisions are done in public on publicly archived mailing lists. So there's no exclusion there. The only thing done in private are basically decisions to vote in new people by the project management committees, and everything else basically should be on the public lists.
Didn't some folks get in a little bit of trouble for kind of just getting together and deciding a bunch of stuff and then not kind of sharing it with the mailing list?
Yeah, it's something you have to be careful about. I mean, you can still meet in person with members of your team and talk about stuff, but you have to post everything on the mailing lists and not make any decisions in a closed group. Basically, everything has to be decided on the mailing lists.
So I think Aaron did a really good job of nailing the key points. For Nifi, we also did not want it to die in private. We want it to die in public. So one of the things about why we chose ASF, and again, this kind of goes to the previous answer, Billy and Adam and the folks, when you go through an agency like the NSA and get people comfortable with releasing something legally, it creates a lot of work, and it helps get people comfortable with the process. And so for us, ASF in that sense was just a really natural fit because they had already helped kind of teach people why it mattered. Another really good point that was made is to grow, ASF exists to grow communities, and so it helps that project become independent of an individual or a company, but make no mistake, it's individuals that make those projects work. You just know going into it as an individual, you are giving your effort to that community and to that software foundation. And so you can't just like expect something to come back from it or expect some level of control. You have to push, but you're pushing for the community. And the other side of it is the license itself is great. And many projects can use it. You don't have to be in the Apache Software Foundation to use it. But one of the other things that that software foundation provides is essentially like a legal protection process or legal clarity to ensure that there's agreements in place and CCLAs, ICLAs, covering the work that you do as an individual or the work that you do on behalf of a company to make that clear. It's sort of a legal indemnification that goes beyond just the license itself, and there's value in that as well.
Thank you. Could we actually hit back on this? So you get to the point, right? You made the decision you want to open source it. You decide you want to go the Apache road, right? I have a tarball, whatever, right? I have my source code. I'm ready to go. How do you get from there to top level project?
Let's see. So one way, I guess the main current way is through the Apache Incubator. You propose your project to the incubator. There's a sort of standard form for doing so of the kinds of information you should provide. And people will generally discuss it with you and then say whether it's a good idea to adopt the project into the incubator. They don't really say no.
Does say no to the incubator portion or the top level project?
To entering the incubator.
Okay. But there are a list of questions, right? And if you just totally fail to answer one of those questions.
Yeah, exactly. You have to work with them. They might sort of adjust your proposal. But, I mean, they're not going to say no because they don't like that particular project or in our case, they're not going to say no because they already have a similar project that is maybe a little bit too similar to your project. They're all about sort of being inclusive and growing new communities. So once the discussion phase is ended and you've adjusted the proposal to their satisfaction, there will be a vote by the Incubator Project Management Committee. And at that point, the project will become an incubator project. You'll request Apache infrastructure resources. And let's see. From then, you'll have sort of frequent reporting to the incubator on your status towards graduation. The main things you have to do to graduate are to basically illustrate you understand Apache rules. You have to be able to make releases, good releases that are passed by the, verified by the incubator. You have to show that you know how to add new people to your community. And did I miss anything?
You have to be able to get releases past Billy. That's pretty much the rule.
Well, and didn't Accumulo, and Accumulo went, again, correct me if I'm wrong, went from incubation to top level status like relatively quickly. So it was released in September 2011 and graduated in March.
March, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we already had a bit of a community surrounding our code, so it wasn't too bad to meet the graduation requirements. And then, let's see, there's a vote on whether you're ready to graduate, and let's see, a proposal is passed to the Apache board, and then they decide whether you should become a top-level project. As a top-level project, you're now sort of responsible for your own quality of releases and ensuring the releases meet Apache guidelines. The board, you still have to report to the board periodically, so they'll check in on you and say, oh, you guys haven't grown your community in a while, maybe you should think about doing that soon. And things like that. But for the most part, the top level projects are more autonomous. Yeah.
Fair enough. Can you briefly talk about the roles in this, right? So there's contributors, committers, PMC chair. What are the different facets by which someone participates in this?
Let's see. So a contributor can be anyone that, say, submits a patch to Apache, usually by attaching a patch to a JIRA or submitting a GitHub pull request. Different projects might also consider maybe someone interacting on the mailing lists a lot could be considered a contributor. Let's see, contributors don't have a sort of responsibilities for ensuring that what they're contributing meets Apache guidelines. So the committers are the ones that can actually make changes to the code base. And they need to understand that anything they commit should be governed by the Apache license. So if they get patches from people they don't know, they may need to ask them and verify that they intend to contribute under the Apache license. Also, we can't add dependencies on things that
I feel like that's fun, and then you can talk about it, right? You can be like, yeah, I went and made this thing better, and you're using my code right now, and you're welcome, and so it's fun. It is a lot of fun.
So, at least in our company's case, I know we were very excited when both of these products went open source, right? We were itching to do some things around it. What advice can you give to either folks that are in the government that believe they have something that would be a good candidate for open source, or you have a contractor who sees something that might be this also looks like a good candidate, or even from the commercial side? So if we can hit on those three, that'd be good.
Yeah. So this is a super loaded question.
Sorry.
No, this is good. We need to expand the time. So, blue or green, this is like irrelevant here, largely, right? If you want to get something open source, then you can throw away all the stuff that you're thinking about on like a company-specific level or a government-specific level, and think about how do I make open source work? There are some very real and very nasty contract challenges that you need to understand. These are things that like projects need to have kind of baked into the contracts as early on as possible. DFARS clauses are important to a lot of people, and you need to make sure that you understand how those relate to your project, how they relate to the ability of the government or your company to take that code that was developed and open source it. There's various numbers there, people who went to school for a long time that can talk to you about that. But we, on our project, frankly, we got very lucky that the clauses that we needed happened to be there. But that's not true on other projects. So even if they built things which are sort of by nature open sourceable, there might be things preventing them from doing that. And so I will just say as a cautionary tale, whether you're blue or green, if you want to get your stuff outside at some point, you want to start as early as possible, making sure that all the contributions made, whether they're blue or green, can in fact be released. Government employees are easy. They have no rights. You can't hold copyright as a government employee whatsoever, but contractors can, right? What you build, what you develop, as an individual, you hold copyright to, unless there's very strange things on your contract. So by and large, that changes the game a bit. Anything I said there that's sweet. But I would just say that the number one thing that I learned is make sure that you understand how the contracts work. This is a team effort too, right? Like, so if you're on a project that's government and contractor developer based, you want to start as early as possible, understanding the contracts, understanding the terms, so that if one day you do want to open source it, that you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of organizing my thoughts so they don't all spill out. If you have something, go ahead.
So not entirely an answer, but something that sparked based on what Joe said. So Apache has these contributor license agreement and corporate contributor license agreement, and there's a software grant. Don't bother trying to get Apache to accept a modified version of either of these. They won't accept it. Let's see.
Did you say they won't accept forks? Or?
They won't accept any modified. If you try to sign, like modify the license agreement and sign it and submit it to them.
They won't accept it. Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
So NSA might think that they aren't allowed to sign the version of the license agreement as is, but that's actually false. They've done it before.
There's a specific clause there that Billy's referring to, which is because government employees can't hold copyright, the NSA wanted to add to the document the simple phrase, to the extent that copyright exists. That's it. And all that was to do was to get across the point that we're granting it to you to the extent it exists. Those words drove the ASF crazy and stalled Accumulo's process for a little while, messed us up very shortly as well. And really the bottom line is just make sure, like Billy said, use the documents the ASF gives you. If you do not, they will punish you in time.
Yeah, so the question was, if you're involved in government work, should you contribute your code, or should you make your code a project?
Or advice for folks that believe they have something they want to contribute. How do I go?
So I would say, as a developer, if you're just a developer, no matter if you're a government contractor, employee, or if you don't work with the government at all, I would encourage you to get involved with open source anyway, for the personal benefits that I described. I think just being a part of that community is great. And so whether or not you can even do it at work, just do it at home anyway. Find a project that you like and join and contribute in some way. If you're thinking about open sourcing something, there's a couple questions I think that can help figure out whether or not it's a good idea. One is it a developer tool? So I'm of the opinion that all developer tools should be open source. And the reason why is because developers not only, developers need to understand what they're using, right? The tools they're using. It doesn't mean you need to like know every line of the Linux kernel so that your web, your web app is performant, but having the ability to go to the source and go to the community that is creating your tools is incredibly important. And I would say Accumulo fits that description, Nifi fits that description, right? It's a tool that people are using to build larger things. And so those being open source is great. If your project does not fit that description, for us, we definitely looked pretty broadly. When we were thinking about building Accumulo, it was like, is there anything else we can do? It was, I do truly feel like it was a last resort for us. And that includes commercial projects too. So it's like, are there other open source things that I can contribute to? Are there commercial things we can use? Those are questions you can ask. And I think, and then you got to answer the question, well, are the terms, what kind of commercial product is it? Does it make any sense to build on that if you're building something on it? I think that building on commercial tools is more problematic than putting a commercial tool on top of open source. That's the way we build our software, our proprietary commercial software. And then the bigger question is, and so if the answer to that is yes, if there are tools that exist, what I see in the government too often is it's great that people are enthusiastic about open source, but I feel like people are creating tools and projects that don't need to be open source, and frankly could end up hurting the idea of open source, right? So open source means a specific thing, and if we start stretching that definition, I think it could actually hurt the community. But the final point is, if you're going to make something open source, I talked a little bit about how you want to have a defined philosophy behind it so that it can survive. And the second question after that, if the answer is yes, is, well, can you build a community around it? And if you can't, or if you're not willing to, then I don't think you should try and open source your code. Now there is code, and a lot of companies do this, where they just take something and they're like, you know what, we're just going to open source this. And that's fine, that's great. It makes it easier for developers that need to use that stuff. But it's a very different thing than saying, I'm going to take this piece of software and I'm going to make it stand alone outside of any one commercial company. Doesn't mean that the open source project will not almost be completely funded by commerce, right? So if you look at Hadoop, right, it stands alone. There's no really one organization that controls it, but probably all of the committers are funded to work on it by their companies, right? So the question is, can you build enough of a community for it to stand on its own? And if so, then great. And I think, and so I think the high level message is that there is a place for all these different types of projects, right? There's a place for open source tools. There's a place for commercial software. There's a place for what I call kind of integration code, or just glue code that nobody really owns, or it's small enough that organizations can maintain. And it's all about survivability. It's all about who's going to maintain your code down the road, who can you call, if you can't answer those questions well, all it means is that the effort that you pour into that code is someday going to be wasted. So that's what we really want to avoid. I mean, nobody wants to build a project that kind of just slowly atrophies over time, and that nobody updates, and that people are interested in, but there's just no lifeblood in it. So I think it's crucial to view software as something you have to keep alive somehow. And there's different ways to do it, and open source is a great way to do it. But that should be your first thought when you're thinking about launching a new project into the world, is how are we going to care and feed for this new thing?
Okay. So why don't we go ahead? We have a little bit of time. Why don't we go ahead and open up to questions? Anybody want to ask the panelists? Go ahead, Al.
You guys want to talk about the importance of the trademark in your name, and maybe some of the interesting names?
So the question was importance of trademark, name, interestingness of names, right?
Let's see. So something you have to do, again, in graduating from the Apache Incubator to a top-level project is ensure that your project name is unique and doesn't conflict with someone else's trademark. So the official name of each project starts with Apache. So Apache Accumulo, Apache Nifi, incubating currently. So that's partially how you can have projects with sort of very generic names like Apache Slider, for example. But it's actually really difficult in some cases to find a name that doesn't conflict with existing trademarks. And there are resources to check that, USPTO search. There are some international ones to check. There'll be, Apache provides guidelines for that. So even if you weren't doing an Apache project, you might want to check out all the things that as an incubator project you should check before you would be able to decide that you could graduate to a top-level project with that name. Apache holds the trademarks on all of its project names and logos. So.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, you're very encouraged to prepend Apache to stuff when you say what it is. Apache Hadoop. Some people are really, really good at it. I'm not very good at it. But naming stuff for me is like the hardest thing. And it really is unfortunate because there's a lot, everything you do, like when you're going onto GitHub, you're like, I'm going to create the next, you know, hyper-threaded web server or whatever, and I'm going to open source it. And then on GitHub's like, what do you want to call it? And you're like, I don't know yet. Like, and then if you name it something, which is almost always stupid, at least in my case, then you have to go and change it later. And we went through this. We had some terrible names.
Yeah, any guess at how many names we went through for Accumulo before we settled on Accumulo? I'm not sure I even remember.
So it used to be called something else, and I'm pretty sure I can say it, but I'm just going to be demure for now and not say it. But that was a dumb name. I thought. I mean, you know, it had a word in it that everybody was using, so it was definitely a strategic thing. But that word was being abused anyway. And then we had some hilarious names. So, and I think Adam was the one who came up with the name Accumulo, which I think is great. A great name, by the way. It hints at clouds.
There was a process that started out as Accumulus, and then that was taken, so we added O.
Nice,
And that was
beautiful. Except you did have a naming collision with just a regular Italian word. So now when I go on Twitter and I search for Accumulo, I get a bunch of Italian tweets and then some stuff about Accumulo. And that's a hard thing too, is like avoiding collisions. And that's why people make up words a lot of time. At least with Apache, you have Apache in front of it, so you could call it like, you know, Apache, you know, cup or something, and people would be like, oh, that's good enough because it's got the word Apache in front of it. But it's just really hard. And we had some really funny names too. Can we mention some of the names? So there's one.
Your secrets are safe here.
That people like that was, notice that nobody else is going to say it. But there's one that I like, which was Icy Table. And the reason they wanted to name, so Accumulo is based on Big Table, so having table in the name was great. Icy Table came from the idea that it was like the IC, right? So the IC's Big Table. But then it had this nice sound to it, like Icy Table, like, ooh, it's cold, like it's icy. And so someone created, I think it was Adam also, created a logo for it. There was a snowflake with 5 sides. Just think about that for a second. And it was so subtle and sinister that people really liked it. Yeah, people were like, that is awesome, but, you know, it didn't end up working out. I like Accumulo, like I say. But that's such a hard thing to do. I don't know how people do it. Niagara Files is great too because you get this idea of flow, and you mentioned regretting the word files in some of your naming, but I think that's a great name. And Nifi rolls off the tongue.
So we had to change Niagara Files, because of trademark fun. There was a company out there that had a product that started with Niagara, and so it also was kind of in a similar space, so it was conflicting. But it was also an opportunity to get rid of the word files, which has just blown people's minds, because they think, oh, if I'm doing stuff with files, then I use Niagara Files. But anyway, I recommend using a password generator for all your upcoming project names. Because honestly, even with the Apache thing in front, it's only like a little bit of safety. Because when you go through the Podling name search, they do say that ultimately it's protected under both names together, but they do want them to stand alone. And so, again, they will punish you in time, right? So you want to be as unique as you can going into it. And obviously that's easier from the beginning.
And pronounceability is secondary. What's that superhero villain's name? Mixelplick or something? It's like all consonants. It is tempting to resort to password generators. And that's why people do things like kind of misspell words now, like or add Lee onto everything, like Sprightly or Spotify Lee or whatever. So it's definitely a challenge.
In the keynote yesterday, right, you guys had a slide that showed like Accumulo was on the map somewhere on like a,
Yeah.
There's examples like that where you are handed here's where you fit in the world slide. Those are helpful and harmful sort of simultaneously, but you can use those sorts of things, and then the power of the Google generally can get you, I think, pretty close to understanding kind of what's out there, where's the gaps, that kind of thing.
What's great about Apache is it's so big that if you just restrict yourself to what's on the Apache web page, you're like, and just ignore the rest of the world. That's what I think most people do. But no, there are other organizations too. There's an organization that I think we've done panels with before. They're open source kind of trade organizations that try and reach out and bring these things to people's attention. Those things exist. I think we could use more of them. I hear about things from other developers in Google probably most of the time. And then 451 is the group that put that research map together. Gartner does some of that stuff, but it's not specifically focused on open source. I mean, there may be an organization out there that I'm not aware of, but it would be great if there was maybe a little more effort in that space.
Let's see. I don't know. You could try searching GitHub repositories, but I imagine that would be a mixed bag. There is at least one website where you can basically register open source projects, and it will do some analysis of the code base and contributors and what's been going on with the project over time.
Am I hot or not for open source?
We need to.
It used to be called olo.net, but the last time I went, it was redirected to something else that I can't remember, something like Open Hub, or I can't remember.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're out of time, so we'll go ahead and close it. Thank you.